Hello, this is Mike Burek, your host and producer of Krynica, The Well, a podcast series about topics of interest to Ukrainians and friends of Ukraine around the world. Today is Wednesday, July 15th, 2026. This episode is produced for The Ukrainian Weekly, a newspaper published in English for the global Ukrainian community since 1933. Our guest today is Andrew Daneri, who is Associate Director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center, where he contributes to the center's work on Ukraine's reconstruction and business and governance in Eurasia. Welcome, Andrew. How are you?
Doing well. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for joining us today. To start off with, please tell us about your educational and professional background.
So I've been at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center for almost 6 years now. I think, are the probably premier think tank in Washington, D.C. that does analysis, convening events, and programming on Ukraine and U.S. relations with Ukraine as well as Europe as well. Prior to coming to the Atlantic Council, I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Ukraine teaching English in southern Odessa Oblast. And before that, I was worked in DC and graduated from Colby College, and have since also done a master's at Georgetown. So love Ukraine, try to get there as often as I can. And yeah, that's the day job.
Andrew, let's launch into the topic for today, which is NATO and Ukraine. When was NATO established and what is its mission?
Sure. So to take a look back, NATO was established in 1949. I think about 4 years after World War II ending. And there were 12 countries that initially came together to form a mutual defense pact. And that has since expanded into 32 members, primarily countries in Europe, um, essentially to pool defense resources and to deter, for much of NATO's life, possible aggression by the Soviet Union. That mission has continued as we've seen Russia be essentially the principal aggressor, probably in the world, but certainly in Europe. And NATO expansion has been demand driven. Countries like the Baltic states, like Poland, others in the Balkans have wanted to join NATO because they understand the threat of Russian aggression, and they want to not only hedge against that, but to basically have more resources to be able to defend, possibly against Russian aggression were it to come, and more likely to deter it from even happening at all. And so NATO is basically probably the most successful defensive alliance in the world, and continues to be so, though it is under new strains probably at this moment.
How often does NATO hold summits and what is their purpose?
Let's see. I mean, in the last several years, NATO's been basically holding these every year, these summits, the most recent one being just last week in Ankara, Turkey. The function of them is essentially to coordinate positions between allies, have all 32 heads of state come together, and agree things like mutual investment deals, coordinate positions, and plan future defensive exercises, essentially reaffirming the cohesiveness of the top level, the leader level, of the alliance. These have gotten, I would say, more frequent in the last several years, particularly after the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine. Previously, these were every 1, maybe 2, maybe 3 years, and recently they've been basically every year. If we go back to the Vilnius summit, from just a few years back, and then Washington, and then The Hague, and now Ankara. I think it's possible the next one will be in 2028, actually. So we might even have a bit of a pause on these NATO summits.
What is the history of Ukraine's relations with NATO? And why does the country want to join the organization?
Well, like I said earlier, I mean, NATO is demand driven, right? These are countries want to join NATO because they understand its power as a defensive alliance, particularly against aggression from the East. And no one knows aggression from the East better than Ukraine, unfortunately. Russia began its war there in 2014, we all remember, and then of course has prosecuted its more full-scale invasion since 2022. And Ukraine has wanted to join NATO at an official leader level for several years. Um, you know, basically going back to in the wake of the 2014 invasion and the annexation of Crimea, Ukraine made some kind of steady steps toward NATO. And let's also not forget the 2008 Bucharest summit, the NATO summit, where Ukraine and Georgia really wanted to join. There were some at that summit pushing for what do they call it, a membership plan for Ukraine, but there was pushback from some countries in Europe, and Ukraine and Georgia were granted the idea that they would one day join NATO, which kind of left them a bit in the middle of not being in the alliance, but maybe provoking additional attention from Moscow. And so what we've seen over the last several years has, I would say, between that 2008 summit and 2022, Ukraine making fitful progress toward its NATO accession, positive but not overwhelming public support. But since 2022, basically the entire country of Ukraine is on board with joining NATO. They understand its power as a defensive alliance, and Ukraine's army, I think, has demonstrated that it would be quite an asset to the NATO alliance, which hasn't had to fight a land war in the way that Ukraine has fought in several decades. And so you've actually seen some quite positive progress toward NATO membership by Ukraine, although there's still a long way to go. And I think, accession talks will still span a number of years if Ukraine continues on this pro-NATO track, which I expect it to do.
Was there any significant shift in NATO policy toward Ukraine at the most recent summit that took place in Ankara, Turkey on July 7th and 8th?
And by now, I think we've most of us have seen the headlines of President Trump um, basically agreeing a license for Ukraine to make some amount of components for Patriot interceptor missiles. These are the missiles that, when you attach them to a Patriot air defense battery, essentially can shoot down incoming ordnance. And right now, everyone understands that the main threat to Ukraine is ballistic missiles, which really only Patriots can shoot down at an effective rate. And Ukraine has been running low on these interceptor missiles for quite some time, and that's why we see some pretty significant destruction in Kyiv and elsewhere in the country, basically because they don't have the ability to shoot these down. So that was a positive to see President Trump, who previously had been maybe a bit more circumspect about U.S. military support to Ukraine, essentially agreeing very publicly at this NATO summit to help Ukraine in the long term get these systems. That will take a number of years to get those supply chains and production lines up and running, which is why the other important policy change that we saw, not at the NATO summit, but directly after in Paris the last couple of days, was this coalition of the willing, the anti-ballistic coalition of the willing by a bunch of European states primarily, I think it's 9, to help Ukraine in the short term get the air defense it needs to be able to shoot down ballistic missiles as they continue to come in over the next several months, in particular because Ukraine will need those defenses as Russia will no doubt look to strike civilian energy infrastructure in the winter, and Ukraine needs to keep the heat and the lights on for as much as possible in the coming months.
Please comment on item number 4 in this statement from the recent summit declaration. And I quote, Ukraine contributes to transatlantic security, and allies stand united in our unwavering support for Ukraine in defending its freedom, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. For 2026, allies pledge $70 billion in military equipment assistance and training for Ukraine, and affirm their sovereign commitments to sustaining at least equivalent levels in 2027, unquote. So please comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, this is a super positive statement by NATO allies to essentially put down in writing and not collateralize, but to kind of collectively total up the amount of aid that allies are sending to Ukraine and commit to doing so in the future as well. I'm not sure that any of this, that 70 billion noted there is new money. It's very likely previously agreed upon packages for Ukraine. But nonetheless, I think it demonstrates the degree to which NATO allies want to support Ukraine, understand Ukraine's importance to transatlantic security, Ukraine's defense's importance to transatlantic security, and their commitment to doing at least as much as they currently are. And I think we've seen with sustained NATO ally support that Ukraine can make quite a significant impact on the battlefield. Some are saying that the tide may even be changing in the war thanks to Ukraine's own drone capabilities. I'm not sure that the tide has fully turned, but we have seen Ukraine, with assistance from allies in a major way, be able to defend itself against Russia effectively, counter Russian capabilities, and continue as a free and sovereign state, which I think is what we all want to see. And of course, we all want this war to end as quickly as possible. No one wants that more than Ukraine, and the aid that allies are pledging, I think, is a manner or intended to get that reliable, sustainable end to the war.
During the recent summit, U.S. President Trump met with Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky. Please discuss the highlights of what they talked about.
I mean, I think the big thing was that the Patriot license deal that I mentioned a little while ago, but this was a really positive meeting, and I think it's worth describing some of the atmospherics actually, and going back to, we all remember the infamous Oval Office meeting between Trump and Zelensky from last year, and that was essentially the nadir of the bilateral relationship between the two countries, but also between the two leaders. They very clearly didn't get along, were not having a good time with each other. And now, last week in Ankara, we see President Zelensky and President Trump sitting there smiling, laughing, cracking jokes about Ukraine's drone capabilities and ability to strike Moscow. I think President Trump, in the public press conference, asked Zelensky, following up on a question from a reporter, would you go to Moscow to meet with President Putin to end this war? And Zelensky said, "Oh, I don't know. It's really dangerous there with all these Ukrainian drones." And they both had a good chuckle about that. And President Trump publicly also supported those long-range strikes, saying, it's a bit escalatory, but maybe this is the way to end the war. So the meeting, I think, was quite positive. Lots of good comments on the military side of things. And I would expect and hope that kind of positive, mutually beneficial relationship to continue in the next several months.
Andrew, we're just about out of time, but I do have a final question for you. If the U.S. grants Ukraine a license to produce Patriot missiles, where will they be manufactured? And how long will it take to ramp up production? And what are the major obstacles for doing this?
Well, frankly, I think this is one of the main questions to be answered. The Patriot Declaration was kind of made as almost a one or two sentence statement by President Trump. I think it's safe to assume that this was something agreed at the leader level in Ankara, because we haven't really seen much detail beyond this. So I think the first order of business for the United States, for Ukraine, for defense industry, and probably for European allies as well, is to figure out exactly what licenses will be given to produce what components and where those will be produced.
Andrew, I want to thank you so much for joining us today on Krynytsia.
Thanks very much, Michael. Pleasure to be with you.
I have been speaking with Andrew Doneri, Associate Director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center, where he contributes to the center's work on Ukraine's reconstruction and business and governance in Eurasia. This episode of Krynytsia has been produced for The Ukrainian Weekly, a newspaper published in English for the global Ukrainian community since 1933. And I'm Mike Burek, your host and producer of Krynytsia. Until next time, that's all for now.